I think a lot of actors were really inspired by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan's work on civil resistance and on like nonviolent resistance. And there was that book that they published a couple of years ago where they surveyed a whole bunch of different social movements for a period of like 100 years. And there were some really, pretty interesting findings, like that nonviolent movements were twice as likely than violent movements to succeed. And they talk about this like 3.5% principle, where no movement that had less than or more than 3.5% of the population like mobilized and active, sustained direct action. None of those failed in their sample. And I'm sometimes it seems like that gets overstated a little bit, and it makes it seem like it's a little bit too easy. All we have to do is get this 3.5%. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts about that, or any advice for activists who are trying to grapple with those with Chenoweth and Stefan's findings.
In terms of the type of strategy to choose, in terms of
Yeah.
strictly, and I mean, so one thing I have to say is that it really depends on how you define these things. One thing that I tend to be extremely skeptical of are claims that disruption and that violence, that it has a negative effect, because I think oftentimes the groups that are using disruption are using what people would define as violence, property destruction. I'm going to say like property destruction.
Sure.
I think a lot of groups that use those tactics are marginalized groups, and it's a really good way to delegitimize a movement, a group of people, organizations, is to say that they're using violence, that the tactics they're using are bad and are alienating people. Because sometimes those tactics are all they've got. They've spent all the other sources. They don't get acknowledgement from the political system. So oftentimes those tactics are the only ones they can choose. So I would say that in terms of a lot of the work that's put out there, I would say from my point of view, I think what is the best way for activists to think about things is to pay attention to the context, to pay attention to not only the political context, but also the cultural context. So if your goal or your target is something that's extremally local, again, like a business, looking at the kinds of political ties that business has, looking at how enmeshed that culture that business is in that small town, looking at those things and taking that into consideration. In terms of, if you alienate people directly around you, is that going to have a really, really bad effect? Taking those things into consideration, especially early on in a movement, that can be, or early on in a campaign, that can be important. Again, it sounds kind of, it sounds like an easy out to say, you have to pay attention to what's around you. But I think that's oftentimes something that activists don't do. They kind of immediately go for, let's have a protest, let's do a picket, let's have a march. And it's like, let's think more clearly about what your goal is, and think more clearly about who your target is, and really research both of those.
Yeah. I love that. So one piece of advice or I guess it's like one point that Pam Oliver made a lot when I took a graduate seminar from her on social movement theory. She would say that one of the most important things you need is a battle plan, and just like having a battle plan as an activist is one of the, and like just do it, like go through, figure out the model, figure out how you're going to do all these factors. And I took that really to heart. And when I look at we can talk about different civil rights campaigns. So think about the Albany, Georgia campaign versus the, what was the other one? The Birmingham campaign that we often contrast, where you could think of there's so many reasons why Albany failed and Birmingham succeeded. But one of them was just the tactical disposition of, it was Police Chief Laurie Pritchett versus the tactical disposition of Commissioner of Public Safety Eugene Bull Connor. And a really nice battle plan is going to include all of that stuff. So we're on the same. I love that.
Absolutely. And I love Pam Oliver's work. I've
Yeah.
crossed paths with her. I was lucky enough to cross paths with her a couple times. And yeah, absolutely. And I think it's especially with the civil rights movement, there's a lot of research looking at different states, looking at looking at two campaigns in two different states, and looking at how the what we call political opportunity structures, how like differing political contexts influence the effects that the same campaign will have in two different states. So it's like being able to adapt your strategy. That's another social movements thing, strategic adaptation. Holly McGammon talks about that, and it's hard. I think a lot of times, I mentioned before the Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty
Mm-hmm.
campaign, and I think that is one of the most it was an amazing movement in the U.S. I mean, we would draw hundreds of people to marches, which for the animal rights movement is really, really hard to do. And their strategy was for animal rights also unusual, going after the pillars that hold up the institution, that hold up the lab, was innovative, and it was effective, and it brought in a lot of activists. But one thing I wonder, and one thing that I think looking back on I can say, is that after 9/11 and after the context shifted and there was an immense amount of repression happening, the campaign, the movement, I'm using those terms simultaneously for a reason. I think there was a lack of an ability to adapt to that. And I think that's part of the reason why that repression had the effect that it did. So yeah, I think it is important to not only like establish a battle plan, but also be able to shift that battle plan when necessary.
Yeah, I love that. And so I want to draw two, I guess one quick point and then connection. We talked about the context, like how sometimes people need to use violent means in the course of their struggles. And the calls for nonviolence can get weaponized sometimes as tools that we can use against activists who have no other choice. And even when we look at like Chenoweth's work, she classifies the civil rights movement as a nonviolent campaign. But like anybody who studies social movements looks at like the deacons of defense and the ways that violence was necessary in the southern states to protect the nonviolent protesters, where you'd have like people doing like, sit-ins, and then outside there were people with guns who were willing to defend them against the actual like Ku Klux Klan. So I think it's super complicated in any movement we look at. But one connection I wanted to draw was like we were talking about, shifting our battle plans. One of my favorite campaigns that I've been reading about is one that my friend Rebecca Clem is doing in western Wisconsin, and she has a former military background, but she's running this amazing campaign. I think part of it is like, and it's against she's going up against facilities that breed dogs for medical testing. So similar in goal to the Shack campaigns, but very different in tactics, because she's going through sort of like the legal ordinance route. But like she's such an amazing, brilliant thinker, and I think it comes from this military background where you figure out your plans and you think everything through, right? I really haven't met many people who can think more clearly than her about strategy. So there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to kind of going back to what you're describing with violence. Again, I think it's really important to emphasize it's how we define violence. For instance, there's a very simplistic self-defense versus violence, right? If something's an act of self-defense, we don't call that violence, we call it self-defense, which is what the Black Panthers were doing. They were using self-defense, right? But the way that nonviolence was weaponized, or that the term violence was weaponized, was to say, look at them carrying guns, look at what they're doing. This is a violent organization. When they had, children's breakfast programs and community building programs, providing healthcare to people. They did so many other things besides defending themselves, but that's what the broader society focused on as a way to delegitimize. And I love that campaign in Wisconsin. I didn't know her name,
Mm-hmm.
but before I left Wisconsin and came out here, There's some, I think it was on Facebook that I was getting notifications about, like, calling local officials,
Yeah.
ask them to not let these breeding facilities in. I think that's a great approach. And the Beagle Freedom Project, they're doing really good work on passing laws to mandate that labs adopt out animals that they're not using in research anymore. And it's such a fantastic campaign because it creates this, it's like, who could be against adopting out their animals, their dogs and cats that they're using? And so when a lab really pushes against it and says, no, we don't want to do this, it's like, what kind of monster are you? And it's
Right.
really, it's just a brilliant work that's happening right now. It's great.
Absolutely is. And so one important thread that I think has come up a couple of times is the idea that, like, we have to respond to state repression. And when we think about, like, so in the animal rights context, I've talked, have you heard of Ronnie Lee? Yeah. So he's one of the founders of the animal rights, or the Animal Liberation Front. And I've had I've had 2 interviews that he's been involved in. But one of the things that he says led to the downfall of the ALF was, in the British context, just this massive increase in, like, repression in terms of, like, the new laws they passed. The police got a lot more clever, and they started reinterpreting old laws, where they would use, like, blackmail laws to target ALF activists, which is, like, not what they're supposed to be used for, but they would. And you brought up the Panthers. I love reading about the ways that they responded to the Mulford Act, because before that, it was this, like, Second Amendment thing. It's like, we have this right to bear arms when we're doing self-defense. All of a sudden, you can't do that anymore, so they have to shift tactics entirely. So it's about, like, we're going to have anti-colonial politics. And it's like the police are an invading force coming into our communities. And I think it's just such a perfect illustration of your point that, like, we need to be able to be agile and shift. When the state represses us in one way, we shift and pivot to another way.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that, bring up ALF, because they're, trying to define the depth of a group like that, when it's not officially an organization. There's different structures that they have, where I've argued in work that they can qualify as an organization. But being decentralized, being anonymous, all these elements make it so that it's like, again, how you define ALF, how you, it's basically an issue of them claiming credit. Is the only way to define it, is when they claim credit. So it's like, you can take any action that is that involves break-ins, or liberating animals, or property destruction, and because they haven't claimed credit as ALF, it's not considered ALF. But I wonder if we didn't consider that, whether or not, like, actions that have happened since then could be considered ALF actions.
Okay. So let's talk about just that for a second. So imagine that I've never heard of the ALF before. What is the ALF? Why might I think they are an organization, and why might I think they're not an organization?
So the ALF is a clandestine group of activists. They are they shift over time. They're anonymous. They engage in militant direct action, things like breaking into labs and taking animals, destroying lab equipment. The ALF has never hurt a person. So again, how we define violence. If we define violence as inherently involving hurting another being, then ALF, at least in the U.S., would not be considered violent, right? But engaged in property destruction, liberating animals, taking records. And they were extremely effective in the US, especially for getting footage of what was happening inside of labs out to the public. Oftentimes, activists would go undercover in labs in different facilities and take videos of what was happening inside. And then after the action occurred, would disseminate that footage. And it was extremely effective for garnering sympathy for animals, and especially for animal research, for science. Science is extremely insulated, so getting inside of that is difficult, and they were effective for doing that. Um, and in terms of defining them as an organization, in social movements literature, if you're going to adhere to strict definitions and characteristics of an organization, they don't fit. But there's certain elements that I've used to say that they can be at least used in research in a way that can shed light on how movements or how organizations within a movement field function. So for instance, they had a press office for a long time. So when an action would happen, a press release would be sent into an office, and that office typically had a representative, right? So it was a person that wasn't involved in the actions that would be responsible for disseminating information from people. They're also long-standing, and they have shared tactics and shared goals. So I think those qualifications or those characteristics can put them in some kind of type of organization, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. And so they're long-standing, right? They've been around since like 1973 in the UK, and I think a little bit later in the US, but like it's been a long time. Um, One question I have, and one thing that sort of always puzzled me about whether or not to call them an organization, is that they haven't, like, it's precisely that they haven't changed. They haven't ossified. They haven't built any like structures that hurt their agility. Like they've remained sort of this loose connection of cells that don't even communicate with one another. Um, is that fact that they don't fit into this pattern of organizations ossifying, becoming more moderate over time, is that at all a challenge to think of them as an organization?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, organizations typically involve, infrastructure types of ways that they are organized. It's like
Yeah.
organization, you're organized, and in some ways, the ALF is not organized. It's so loose based that they don't have types of infrastructure. But in that way, and perhaps this is like an element of cultural influence, where like not the myth, but the storytelling involved with ALF has created a kind of, it has sustained, right? It's like sustained this type of this reputation that I think has provided it with some longevity, and so there's pros and cons to that. In some ways, it goes against a lot of the research on organizations that have strong infrastructure, that are larger. They're more likely to sustain themselves, to last longer, to exert more influence. But it's the type of influence that they have, and it's the how we define longevity, or an organization that lasts. It's these things again are contingent upon definitions. But yeah, there's pros and cons to it. I mean, one of the cons to having an organization that doesn't have a really strong infrastructure is that the message can get messed up. So like I remember seeing, I don't remember the action, but I remember there was one ALF action, and the footage that was released made the activists look like a bunch of like frat dudes who were in like having fun and bashing stuff, and it was unsettling, right? So it's like, I think being able to control your image, control your message, that's something that a really strong organization with strong infrastructure provides. When you don't have that, it's much easier for your message to get lost, to get distorted, and for your image to become kind of possibly tainted or just different from what you want it to be.
Yeah, well, that is fascinating. I had no idea about the ALF frat thing. Yeah, but it's not, it's not a character, but it's like there was one action that was like an ALF thing. I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
I wish I could remember the I don't remember the action it was, but it was one where the footage just wasn't, it looked like they were having some fun. It like looked like they were having a blasty blast, and it was not it felt like it kind of distorted the image that previous to then had been pretty strong in terms of sticking to like, this is a serious thing that they're doing. This is something that has an impact. It's something that like affects animals, affects science. And I should say that too, is that a lot of those actions ended up releasing information about distorted science, like ways that scientists were not conducting their experiments properly. Information was erroneous. So like that's another important effect that they had on human health as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think this points at something really important, which is that sometimes people who are critical of the use of animals in research are painted as being anti-science, but that's just not accurate. Um, I think we're all. I imagine everybody in this conversation is critical of the use of animals in scientific research, and we're not anti-science. It's just that we need to be asking questions about which types of interventions are we allowed to do in order to gain knowledge, and we can also look at actual examples of sloppy science that don't actually help us. It's yeah, it's a really fascinating thing.
Very
Yeah,
rigorous, like scientific methods using animals that have not helped us. Like a lot of what led to chimps, the moratorium on chimp
yeah,
research in the U.S. was they found that it wasn't producing data that was usable for us. So I think in a lot of ways we've had really terrible results from animal research, even when it's conducted properly.
yeah. Well, that is fascinating. One thing I'm wondering about is like, yeah, here's one direction that I'm going to ask. So when we talk about violence, right, there's this question of whether the ALF stuff should be considered violence, because it does involve property destruction in some cases. And I've seen like three different types of definitions of violence. And Trudy Govier, she does work on peace studies. She has like this really nice distinction that I think is helpful, where there's like minimal definitions that try to tie, I guess, yeah, really stringent definitions that try to tie violence to something like, it's using physical force to cause harm to like a sentient individual, something like that. Or you could have definitions that incorporate a whole lot more, where it's something like, we're thinking about like emotional harms as being caused by insults. You could think about like violent speech. And then there's a third, which I haven't seen this in the scholarly literature, but I did see it in a book called This is an Uprising by two people whose last name is, I think, Engel. And basically, they define violence as pretty much anything that, I mean, it's not like a strict definition, but they're like, instead of focusing on philosophical debates about what violence is, let's just look at what causes a negative radical flank effect. Like, let's just look at what people identify as violent and then reject. And I think that there are huge trade-offs between all these three different things. And I was wondering if you could like speak to that a little bit, and specifically in the context of like whether we should call the ALF violent.
Yeah, so it's so funny that you brought up that book. This is an uprising book. I worked at a labor union for a couple of years before going back into academia, and that book was caused an uproar.
Really?
Yes, because I thought it was, whatchamacallit. I did not like a lot of that book, and mostly because of how they defined violence. And I think that book plays into exactly what I was talking about before, as far as delegitimizing tactics and groups because you don't define something well. So I think another form of violence, I think one thing I'm going towards is this concept of structural violence.
Sure.
I want to say I'm blanking on the name. They wrote Pathologies of Power. Paul Farmer. Okay. He writes about it in health studies. But it's the idea that the way that the political system is structured, the way the economic system is structured, the political economy is structured, exerts forms of violence on people, forms of harm on people, and that those groups of people are oftentimes marginalized, right? So marginalized groups. Black and brown people, women oftentimes experience disproportionate amounts of harm due to the ways that the system is structured. So I think part of what I go to, and bear with me because this is not something that I've kind of thought through in terms of how it's anchored to work by scholars who study definition, who are seeking to like define violence. But I think looking at who benefits from it like when there's a form of violence, is someone benefiting from that violence, and in what ways are they benefiting? And so I think that puts into question self-defense versus attacking someone because of hateful prejudice, or because you want something from them. It kind of puts it into different light. And I think, as for me, I think the issue of causing harm directly to individuals and instigating it, I think there's something about that is important to consider when we're using the term. So yeah, again, I haven't thought through these things in terms of anchoring it to people who have, especially in philosophy. But
sure, yeah. And I'm sorry to like throw this at you. It's sort of like a philosophy question, but no, I really enjoyed that. I think one other distinction that I'll just throw, because I think this might be interesting for the people watching, is that we distinguish between value laden and value neutral definitions of violence. So a value laden definition is going to say something like this: violence is bad, and so they might look at an act that brings about good effects. Maybe the same speech act could bring about good effects in some contexts and negative effects in some other contexts. And then maybe you'd want to say that in one case was violent, in the other case it wasn't. So maybe suppose somebody's yelling like F Trump, and the very similar speech act could be like F so-and-so. And so-and-so is somebody who's going to be really badly, offended by that remark, and they're not somebody who is deserving of it. You can tell what my politics are by how I phrase that sentence. But like, you know what I mean? So like that's what like a value laden definition might do. And I'm suspicious of those, because I want to be able to classify something as violent or nonviolent based on like without knowing whether what they did was good or bad, but just by looking at the act. And what I worry about is like, for anything like structural violence, I don't think there's structural harms. But like when I look at definitions of structural violence, sometimes there are things like, if your actual somatic experiences are different than what your potential would be, and the cause of the difference is a social structure, then that's structural violence. I'm suspicious of that, because I worry that we're talking about harms, and that violence should be one specific category of harm. And I think some harms are worse than violence. You could reject the more wide definition of violence and still think that lots of things that don't fall under violence are much worse than violence, but still want to have a precise notion of it that restricts it to physical harm for other reasons, like the value of being able to say that like all the nonviolent protest tactics in Gene Sharp's book actually count as nonviolent. So that was sort of long-winded, but.
And I'm thinking that, I think part of the problem with the value laden versus you can't divorce the term from its connotations. You can't divorce the term from the context in which it's used, right? So when you use violence, like the word violence inherently means bad, period. And so that's why how we deploy it is so important. Saying that this is a good kind of violence. Not just give it another term, because the term violence involves so many connotations that it's impossible to divorce it from those connotations. And I think with structural violence, I find it, types of social structures that put certain groups of people into harm's way. I don't see a problem with that. I don't see a problem with that definition, because more so what is the problem is how you define those social structures in the group. So it's like, you could say that if you have a group, if you have like some social structure puts rich white men into harm's way, and I would be like, well, who, like number one, which one were you talking about? Like, that's this. But then, and obviously, I am not doing any work with sugarcoating my.
Right, that's totally fine. That's why it was going to be a fun interview.
um, uh, so, but I think when that's done, if you were to analyze a social structure that put privileged people in harm's way, it would be dismantled pretty quickly. That doesn't exist
Mhm.
does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So I think where I'm coming from is more like I want to say everything in Gene Sharp's politics of nonviolent action are nonviolent, and that's going to include things like nonviolent harassment, where we used it. It was used against slave catchers, where they would come into town and you would point to them and you'd follow them around and you would say like, this person is a slave catcher, get them out of our town. And what you're doing is you're creating certain kinds of social systems to make certain people's lives worse. I think it's justified. I'm totally on board with that. And I want to call that not violent. I think if they had punched them, I think that if they had like picked up a stick and like hit them with it, I would want to call that violent. And I think because of things like that, because of more aggressive nonviolent social movement tactics, I still want to preserve the category of violence for things that are caused by physical force, but still acknowledge that structural harms are no better than violence. And in many cases, they're a lot worse than violence. Where like, I'd much rather have somebody just like punch me than like do this sorts of structural harms that would just destroy me. Like, I don't think I could survive certain things, but I could survive a punch. So it's not to say that there's anything, less bad about them. It's just that I worry that if we expand the concept of violence beyond physical harm, we're going to lose out on the ability to say that the vast menu of civil rights and other tactics used throughout the history of social movements are nonviolent.
I mean, again, I would say that that's such a good example, and I think the animal rights movement has historically has used this, has had to just grapple with definitions of violence for a long time, because I would say forms of harassment that are meant to address egregious things that people are doing, that is also self-defense. I think that's self-defense, and that can be considered in as opposed to being violence, as forms of self-defense. And that's what you know there's a collection of essays, terrorists or freedom fighters.
Yeah, see best and no sala. Yeah.
Yeah, so that goes into that a lot, where we're kind of agents of self-defense, like activists are agents of self-defense on behalf of animals. So yeah, I don't,
Yeah.
I for sure, like in my classes, when structural violence is a touchstone in a lot of my classes, and a lot of ways I talk about it is like, this is in a lot of ways worse than physical violence. Structural violence can be a lot worse. It kills people
Yeah.
insidiously in ways that you can't address. But so yeah, I see your reservation as far as putting something into the category of saying that all things that are violent is bad. I can kind of see your reservation about it, but again, I think there's forms that you're thinking of that would not be considered violent. That would be considered self-defense and forms of defense of others.
Okay. It was really interesting. And I think like it's sort of like really clear where the disagreement is. It's a very sort of like sharp, clear thing. On the one hand, I want to say that self-defense can also be violent. It's just that it's justified violence. It's that, and I think on the other hand, there's things you want to say that are violent that I want to say are not violent. They're worse than many cases of violence. But we're not really disagreeing about any of the cases. And I think that neither of us is excusing anything that the other isn't excusing. It's just that I want to use the word violent differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's sort of cool. And I think it comes down to like, what are our theoretical virtues, like values that we're trying to capture. I think the thing that I care about most is can we classify everything that Gene Sharp talks about as being nonviolent? And I think that what you want to capture is, can we use all the tools at our disposal to categorize the immense, horrible harm of structure of that structures do to people, including the word violence? And I think that they just sort of like they push against each other, and you can't have it both.
You must
Um,
come, I would think that this could be just like a philosophy versus sociology issue too.
really?
So
Okay.
I suspect that when you read social movements literature, that you probably come across this a lot in terms of how things are conceptualized. Because philosophy is it's a different discipline for
Hmm.
that reason, because it asks different questions. Um, it's whatchamacallit, like what I do is very, very grounded in what is happening in front of me, around me. And philosophy looks at things in terms of like things like ideal types. What is, I think we talked like ideal types is what sociology would call it.
Hmm.
Where you take something that doesn't exist in pure form, but you pretend it exists in its purest form, as a way to analyze society.
I see.
And that's the only reason we use those kinds of I, 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 ideal types, or like ways of categorizing things, so that they're pure. I think like being able to define violence as something pure is
Okay.
tough. Yeah.
I guess I see in there's like a strand of sociology and a strand of philosophy that both really concern themselves with like ideal types. Like you have like Weber and like all that's pretty ideal, right?
He's the one that
Yeah.
created. Yeah.
Yeah, and then when we think about like in philosophy, I think about like Aristotle versus Plato, where Plato's doing this really ideal kind of thing, and we have other people like I don't know, Rawls doing ideal theory, where we think about these idealized models of what society could look like. But then I think most people doing stuff like applied ethics uh, don't want to do so much of that. That they want to look at, what are the actual facts on the ground that inform our subjecting phenomena to scrutiny.
So it's not mischaracterized. Like
Yeah.
the ideal types in sociology isn't in terms of the ideal in terms of like a normative sense,
Mhm.
like this is the best way to have. It's more so a pure type. So maybe instead of thinking of it as ideal type, maybe think of it as pure type. So it's like you have like Weber looked at types of leadership. So if you have like if you have like three types of leadership, one leader is going to have more than one of those qualities, like charismatic, and you can be charismatic and also have like have legitimacy, political legitimacy. So yes, so anyway, just because I don't want any
Right.
sociologists who watch this to be like, what the hell, she doesn't even know what rule types mean. So just yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.